Have you ever been out spotlighting in the bush at night? What are some of the nocturnal native animals you might see around where you live? Maybe brush-tailed possums or tawny frogmouths. And now I'd like you to imagine what it might have been like a couple of hundred years ago when the bush was full of native animals, and especially those small native mammals, which have pretty much disappeared thanks to cats and foxes. Wherever you went in Australia, you'd likely see one or two species of bandicoots snuffling around, bettongs or potoroos hopping through the undergrowth, and little marsupial carnivores hunting insects and small animals. There were native rodents, including some really unique species, galloping through the trees and on the ground. And that vision of a landscape full of animals is what Australian Wildlife Conservancy has been working towards at Mt Gibson Wildlife Sanctuary in Western Australia for over a decade. I'm joined today by Dr. Amanda Bourne. Amanda is AWC's lead ecologist in the southwest region of Western Australia to tell us about this milestone that we've reached at Mt Gibson, where over 10 years we've released 10 species as part of this ambitious wildlife restoration project. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Joey. It's nice to be here.
To start off with, I'd like to hear a little about your research background. So you worked prior to AWC in Southern Africa. Can you tell us about what you were studying there?
Yeah, I've worked in conservation NGOs for my whole career, and a lot of that time was in South Africa. I've been in Australia for about 5 years now, and my focus for most of my career has been on understanding the impacts of extreme weather and a changing climate on ecosystems, species, and people, and looking at ways to adapt. So I'm an arid zone kid, and I've mostly worked on extreme events in the arid zone. So really looking at droughts and heat waves, that kind of thing. During my PhD, I studied a cooperatively breeding bird called the southern pied babbler, which we otherwise know as the black and white shouty bird. They're very charismatic, social, interact with each other a lot. And they've got names. So actually that bird in the photo that you've got there, Joey, on the scale, she's Amiga, and we named them after the ring combinations on their legs. So medal is the M, and then she's got green and yellow there. So green and yellow gives us Amiga. That's in the Kalahari Desert, the population that I studied. Yeah, they're just really quirky. And the population that I worked with is habituated as well. So it was possible to kind of wander around with them in the bush and observe their behaviors really close up without disturbing them. It sort of feels a little bit like being a Disney princess. So you're walking through the dunes and I would whistle and the birds would come over and hang out with me. They were trained, as you showed earlier, to hop onto a scale in exchange for a little bit of food, like a bit of crumbled egg yolk or a mealworm or two. And I was really looking at the effects of temperature and rainfall on them from a whole bunch of different angles. So I looked at behavior, I looked at physiology, developed some non-invasive methods for metabolic rate and dehydration metrics. And I looked at survival and reproduction, and really found overall that the babblers were quite, they're quite well adapted to their arid environment. They cope pretty well with hot and dry conditions. But when hot and dry conditions occur, when extremely hot and dry conditions occurred together as a hot drought, that was when the population really struggled. And I recorded, very low recruitment of young into the adult population in years with hot droughts, and much lower than normal interannual survival of adults in extreme years like that.
Yeah, they look like real characters. And I think when we were chatting earlier, you said, you didn't say I was watching these birds. You said I was hanging out with these birds. You
Oh
sort of
yeah.
put them into their families and interacting with them, which is a lovely way of having a study species like that.
Oh
Um,
yeah, it was such a pleasure.
I'm interested that you've come from the arid zone in this completely different continent. There's a photo you shared here of the area where some of that field work was happening, not too
Yeah.
dissimilar to the sort of parts of the arid zone in Australia. But clearly you're drawn to the arid zone and the sort of questions that you can ask of ecosystems there.
Yeah, definitely. I just love those wide open spaces. So yeah, I like that about Southern Africa, and I really like that about the parts of Australia that we work in as well. Both up the west coast of South Africa, where I worked before going to do my PhD, and now in Southwest WA. Those are both biodiversity hotspots, so just also incredibly diverse in terms of plant diversity and endemism, and highly threatened as well. So really big priorities for conservation.
So, in your role as regional ecologist in the Southwest region, you oversee our science programs at 4 very different wildlife sanctuaries, including our first, so Karakamaya, where you are now in the Perth Hills. Tell us about the other places that you work and a bit of an overview of the science program that you oversee.
Yeah, sure. So in my role, I oversee our ecological monitoring, translocations, and research programs at 4 AWC wildlife sanctuaries in WA. So Karakamaya and Purina in the Perth Hills, just an hour or so outside of Perth, and then 4A Island in Shark Bay, and Mt Gibson on the eastern edge of the Wheatbelt. I manage a team of 7 ecologists and a couple of interns at any one time. And to give you an idea of the scope of the program, last year we ran 29 surveys and 3 translocations. And we're currently working on or supporting 26 active research projects spanning a whole range of topics from animal behavior, plant and invertebrate distributions, eDNA, and genetics. So yeah, we also work alongside an outstanding team of land managers in the region who are responsible for implementing our ferals, weeds, and fire programs on all of those properties. Yeah, 2 quite arid, and then 2 in the Jarrah Forest here around the Perth City.
Wow, that's a massive program, and incredible to hear there's so many research projects going on, either using species at our sites, hosting external researchers, or they might be AWC-led projects. And, I guess one of the major programs that we talk about a lot is our translocations and reintroduction programs. Mt Gibson in the Wheatbelt has been the site of one of our most ambitious of these reintroduction programs. So just over a decade ago, we set out to restore some of the locally extinct mammal species to this part of Australia. If you look at maps where species have disappeared from Australia, that particular spot in the sort of arid part of the southwest is where we've lost almost as many mammal species as anywhere else. So, something like 16 or 17 mammals that would have been there a couple of 100 years ago are now missing. And for some of them, they're completely extinct. For others, they've persisted either in the wild, in small patches, or on offshore islands. But really, it's been those feral predators, cats and foxes, that have been responsible for most of those declines. At Mt Gibson, though, we're turning the clock back to what the landscape might have looked like. This is a huge project, and I know you've sort of come into it over the past few years and been involved in some of the more recent reintroductions. Tell us about sort of the broad objective of what we're trying to achieve by restoring those missing mammals.
Yeah, well, Mt Gibson is on Badamaya country and was purchased, or the lease to Mt Gibson was purchased by AWC in 2001. It's an incredibly important property because it sits right on the transition between the southwest and the rangelands. So there's a lot of plant diversity, a lot of sort of geomorphic diversity. And an early study at Mt Gibson found that at least 15 mammal species had gone locally extinct, 5 of which are globally extinct. So as you were saying earlier there, Joey, and this is a situation pretty typical of the wider Wheatbelt region. Plans were made to reintroduce 8 of those locally extinct species and to bring in some ecological replacements for a couple of others. So there's 10 species in total, with Shark Bay bandicoots, coming in as an ecological replacement for the now extinct western barred bandicoot, and greater stick-nosed rats for the now extinct lesser stick-nosed rat. Over the course of the first few years of owning the property, a 7,800 odd hectare fenced feral predator-free exclosure was constructed. Was finished in 2015. At the time, it was the largest single pen fenced area on mainland Australia, so it was quite an ambitious project. And the 10 species was also the sort of largest number of species that had been attempted at that time. There's now are other projects with larger fenced areas and more species going in, which is really exciting to see that level of ambition growing across Australia. Reintroductions began immediately as soon as ferals were eradicated from that fenced area. And we recently celebrated a major milestone at Mt Gibson with the release of the last planned cohort of the last planned species in November last year. So that was our final few footage that were released onto Mt Gibson late last year. The whole project to date has involved well over 50 translocations of nearly 1,000 individual animals.
It's huge. It's huge. And so just going out there at nighttime now, and we'll talk about sort of some individual examples of how those populations have gone. But what's it like? Like if you go out with a torch as you go into that safe haven, do you see animals every time?
Oh, I'm pretty much, yeah. Yeah, pretty much. I will never forget when I started in 2022, the first time I went into that exclosure. I mean, we had stick-nose rats running across our feet just about. We saw banded hair wallabies, shark-bay bandicoots, woylies, bilbies, and just a huge diversity of native mammal species. They were doing, really, really well as boom conditions in 2022, and we saw a lot. I've just come back from Mount Gibson a couple of weeks ago. We've just run a major mammal trapping survey, and we had some great sightings of baby bilbies and tiny little shark-bay bandicoot young. We were catching bandicoot young that were about 60 grams. They've just popped out of the pouch, more or less. Really, really cute, and a lot of activity. Yeah.
A place I still haven't been to, Mount Gibson, and it's really one of AWC's trailblazing reintroduction sites. We had Scotia for slightly longer. We talk about New Haven a lot, and then the partnership projects in New South Wales at the Pilliga and Mallee Cliffs National Park. But Mount Gibson is quite a different landscape with bits of mallee and bits of really tall woodland, salt lakes, granite outcrops. It sounds beautiful, and I will definitely visit at some point. So it sounds like by and large, animals have done well, but of course there have been some ups and downs. Talk us through how we monitor the success of a reintroduction. So, we don't just chuck them in and wish for the best.
So we work through a lot of different phases for something like that, Joe. So we, in the long term, we're aiming for sort of self-sustaining natural populations of these reintroduced species that we hope they'll persist, for a long time to come. But in the early days after those initial releases, we're really looking at health and survival of the founders. Then we sort of move on to try to find evidence that they're breeding, that young are recruiting successfully into the new population, and that population size is increasing and the distribution of the animals across the release area is increasing as well. We get all of that information from a whole variety of methods, including sort of radio tracking collared individuals after release, trapping animals and checking the females for their pouches to see if they've got any signs of breeding, or trapping new individuals, so it's evidence that they have recruited some into the population because there obviously weren't any there before. So if it's not an animal we know, then it's Mt Gibson Bourne and a good evidence. We also see animals with young on our cameras, and we estimate population size using a whole range of different methods. When we set out to plan the Mt Gibson project, a huge part of the aim was to maximize genetic diversity. So we sourced animals from a whole lot of different locations, and we're in the middle now of assessing genetic health and looking at that sort of mixture and whether we achieved what we were hoping to achieve there. And then longer term, we look out for, we want to see persistence. So we want to see populations sticking around. We don't necessarily want to see them continuing to increase all the time. We want to see them sort of behaving normally in response to environmental conditions and fluctuating in numbers, but persisting.
One of the species that I understand has been more difficult to establish, and not just at Mount Gibson, but across other sites too, is the greater stick-nest rat. Just describe to us what this animal is like to work with, but also the challenges of getting a population established.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think marsupial reintroductions have been, going really well at Mount Gibson and a lot of other sites, but rodents have been much more difficult. And yeah, the greater stick-nest rats were actually the first species released at Mount Gibson. In fact, several years before the exclosure fence was finished, there was a sort of breeding pen built for stick-nest rats, and so they were in there for 5 or 6 years before being released into the wider exclosure. But the stick-nest rats were quite tricky to monitor. They don't show up easily on cameras, and it took them a while to settle in a couple of spots on the sanctuary. In the end, we only found high numbers of stick-nest rats in 2 small locations on the property, so they never really increased in population size the way that we saw some of the other species doing. Most of the other species doing, in fact, most of the marsupials. They did persist at Mount Gibson for a really long time, about 15 years, but we've just come out of a historic drought in the region. So 2023 was one of the driest years on record, and the 2023 to 2024 summer was extremely hot. And we did see a very large decline in that stick nose rat population. And to date, we haven't seen any sign of recovery there.
Things like macropods can adjust or they can sort of pause their reproduction when conditions are bad, when there's not enough food around, and then press play again and resume. So give us a couple of examples of marsupials which have become established in the fenced area.
Yeah, I mean, all of them.
Yeah, okay, great.
So, but yeah, the hardy, fast breeding species like bilbies and woylies, they really increased very rapidly in population size after their initial releases. And we did see them coming down a little bit in the drought, as would be expected with those severe conditions, but we're certainly seeing them bouncing back already now. And while other species like red-tailed phascales and banded hair wallabies are a little bit slower to get going, we're very confident in those reintroductions, and they show much smaller fluctuations between years and a not as extreme response to the really dry conditions. So we're feeling really confident in those. Recently, possums and chuditch have gone in, so possums and western quoll. And they've all gone well to start with, so we're in that sort of early establishment phase with them. But we've had high survival of founders and lots of good evidence of breeding. But we've recorded 13 new chuditch so far, which should be the first chuditch born on Mount Gibson in a little over 100 years now. So they're pretty exciting to see. We identify them from unique spot patterns on their coats.
Yeah. And what about numbats? I have to ask about numbats.
Oh, yeah, numbats are great. In fact, numbats are probably my favorite Australian mammal. Coming from South Africa, we see a lot of animals because the mammals are large and a lot of them are diurnal, and you don't really get that so much in Australia. Everything's nocturnal and kind of cryptic, but the numbats are, yeah, probably my favorite. They're the closest I can get to a meerkat or a zebra, something that I can see out and about during the day. They're doing well at Mount Gibson. We continue to see them. In fact, we caught several females over the middle of that drought carrying pouch young, and so they seem to handle those conditions pretty well.
Yeah, great. I was going to ask about the sort of research that you can do with a project like this, with your interest in sort of climate change and drought and modelling for populations into the future. There must be huge opportunities there with this sort of project. Have you got time to do some research projects outside of all this work?
Yes, I mean, we still host a lot of students, and we've got some ongoing or just completed student research projects on numbats and stick nose rats, looking at their habitat use and thermal refuge, and so where do they go and hide when it gets really hot. What we need to look at the impacts of environmental conditions is long-term data sets. So by doing the annual monitoring at Mount Gibson of each reintroduced species, we're slowly starting to build up these longer term data sets where we can look at the effect of variation in rainfall and temperature between years. We probably want 15 or 20 years of data for that. For some species, we're approaching 10 years now. So starting to get those data sets together.
Yeah, 10 years into a very long-term project. Okay, let's talk now about the Woylie. So this is also called the brush-tailed bettong, one of those little sort of pocket-sized, looks like a wallaby, but it's in a separate family, bettongs and potoroos. The Woylie is sort of the version which was relatively widespread across woodland and grassland habitats throughout arid and southern inland Australia, and even over to the east as well. So it had a very broad distribution. Just tell us about how the Woylie population has fluctuated quite dramatically since they were there.
Yeah, so Woylies are sort of a great success story for Mount Gibson. They were one of the first species reintroduced, and they did so well right from the get-go. We had about just over 150 founders from various locations, and they rapidly grew to about 3,000 individuals just in a few short years. And they spread across the whole exclosure. This is a boom and bust species, which means they can increase rapidly during good conditions, and then they tend to contract quite a bit during droughts. And that's exactly what we've seen at Mount Gibson in recent years. So the Woylie population did kind of contract a bit during the drought to around 700 individuals. But this is very normal, and we were really quite encouraged by the response. That 700 is still a very large number. And in the last couple of months where it started to rain again and we've been surveying the population, we're already estimating that they've increased again to over 1,000 individuals. So they're very responsive to improvements in conditions. And yeah, combined with the very high genetic diversity of this population, in fact, one of the highest genetic diversity populations in Australia, due to that sort of sourcing of founders from different areas. And our sort of lots of evidence of breeding and new individuals that we got during our recent trapping, we're sort of feeling really confident that Woylies are going to be well suited to the Mount Gibson environment in the long term.
Now, the next chapter for the project here is looking not just at the fenced area where so many of those species have established and seem to be doing really well. Of course, we've got quoll, western quoll, the chuditch, and brush-tailed possum outside the fence as well. And that's only possible because of a massive feral predator control effort. I'll share this map, and can you just talk through the scale of that effort put into controlling feral predators outside of the fenced area at Mount Gibson?
Yeah, the team at Mount Gibson has been baiting with Eradicat, which is a sort of 1080 poison sausage bait, every year for the last 5 years over about 70,000 hectares. So that whole kind of grey lined area in the map there.
Right.
And we started off with a 20,000 hectare in the blue in the middle, but only did that for 1 year and then very quickly expanded to really most of the property, which we do every year, along with a couple of rounds of ground baiting over about 100 kilometres of track.
So the safe haven, the fenced area here, is that grey box sort of
Yes,
on
the
the
solid
right
grey
side of
box,
the
that's
property.
correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. There's an on-site full-time feral animal control officer, Aaron, who also deploys canid pest ejectors along the southern boundary, which is the only part of Mount Gibson that borders on cleared agricultural land, and that's to try to control foxes coming in from the farmlands to the south. And does a lot of cat trapping around the edge of the exposure and along a lot of the tracks in the release area in the north there. We have had 120 cameras permanently deployed across that outside the fence area for 5 years, looking at cat and fox activity and how that's responding to the baiting and other cat control programs.
That's a lot. So
Yes.
that's an ongoing effort to sort of keep that pressure on feral predator populations outside of the safe haven. And then there's another sort of development, which not part of the original plan, but the fences that we're talking about in these safe havens, yes, they're 6 foot tall. Yes, they're electrified with 2 hot wires on the outside, and they've got that overhang, but they're not really designed to keep animals in. They're only designed to keep cats and foxes out. And so tell
Right.
us about some of the reintroduced species that have been actually scaling the fence, making it out, in some
Yeah.
cases persisting.
Yeah, we have records of Woylies outside of the fence from as early as 2017. So just 2 years after they were reintroduced to the property, some of them were letting themselves out of the exposure and going exploring on the rest of the property. Since we put that big camera array up in 2019, we've recorded increasing numbers of Woylie detections on the cameras outside the fence each year, stabilizing over the recent drought. On the camera array, we've got images of females with big pouches. We've got images of animals with young at heel. So we know they're attempting to breed out there as well. And yeah, as you're showing on the map there, Joey, Woylies aren't the only ones that have released themselves from the exclosure. So we also have detected a handful of bilbies outside, a couple of red-tailed phascogales, and a shark-bay bandicoot and a numbat.
Are any of these animals surviving between years, or is it just sort of getting out and then, eventually being gobbled up by a cat or fox?
Yeah, we would expect that's the case for the shark-bait bandicoot, but we certainly know that at least some Woylies are surviving outside of the fence. We've caught a male Woylie outside 2 years in a row, so we know for certain that at least he has survived a period outside the fence. But otherwise, we don't really know at this stage, how many are out there and if the population is viable or self-sustaining. So we're currently planning an intentional release of Woylies where we'll radio collar a number of them and try to get a better handle on what their survival probabilities are once they get out of the fenced area.
That's pretty exciting. So, we've basically nailed the science of these fenced predator exclosures in Australia. In most environments with most of the species we're talking about, it's a very effective conservation measure, which is why AWC has invested so much in our network of feral predator-free exclosures. But, pushing the boundary of that, what sort of science needs to be done before we can expect populations in an unfenced landscape of things like woylies and bilbies and some of those more predator-prone mammals? What are the questions that we still need
Mm.
to answer?
Yeah, so I think again, it's about taking a phased approach and then trying to learn as much as possible at every step that you take. So before we put any animals outside the fence, we conducted, a couple of years of predator control, and we looked at the impact of those management efforts on feral cat and fox activity. And then we took a couple of species that we know are quite robust to predation by cats and foxes. They already live in the Perth area, outside of fenced areas in fairly large numbers, things like brush-tailed possums and chuditch. And we've spent a few years releasing them outside the fence on purpose with collars and looking at survival rates and doing a lot of intense monitoring of radio collars, trapping and camera arrays. So we had 100% survival of possums. And so that gave us the confidence to try with chuditch. And we've had a couple of cat predations on chuditch, but overall quite high survival, so around 70% survival of collared individuals of chuditch. So with both of those species doing well, we continue to see them. They're breeding. There's new animals. One possum looks like it's about to move into the supporter accommodation on Mount Gibson. So there's Simbi possums in the roof there. But we've learned a lot from those, and with the intentional release of woylies that we're planning to do soon, will be an opportunity to learn a lot about something that's a bit more predator susceptible. We also know that woylies do persist outside of fenced areas in several locations around WA, but they'd likely have a bit more of predation risk. So this will be an opportunity for us to really learn a lot about what those tolerable thresholds of cat and fox activity are going to be in wider landscapes. And we would spend a few years thinking hard about that before we progress to any of the more sensitive species like bilbies or phascogales.
That's very exciting. And this is kind of, really expanding the possibilities, hopefully, of what we can do with restoring native wildlife to places like Mount Gibson. Do you think down the track there's a future where we get back to a point with large populations of things like woylies, banded hair wallabies, bandicoots living outside of these fenced safe havens, at a landscape scale?
Yes, I hope so. Well, you said earlier, feral predator-free areas are, incredibly important part of conservation in Australia. They are the saving grace for a lot of species that are really sensitive to cat and fox predation. But there's a practical limit to the size of area that you can enclose in a predator-free fence. So for those species that can cope with a low level of predation, we would love to see them occupying a much larger area across the Australian mainland. Our cat and fox control measures are getting better all the time. And yeah, it would be great to get to a point where we can see a lot more activity of native species, so we can see those diggings and tracks and sightings of animals outside of fenced areas across the wider landscape. We're putting a lot of effort into monitoring reintroduced species and co-occurring predators, as well as other people working in the space across Australia. We're all trying to learn as much as we can about what's possible at our sites, but then what might be possible across Australia as well.
Amanda, thank you for sharing the story of the Mount Gibson Mammal Restoration Project at this exciting milestone, a decade in to a very long-term project and 10 species released at the site, really raising the bar for what's possible with rewilding in Australia. Thanks to you and your team for all the work that you do.
Thanks for having us on, Joe.